If you remember the game of consequences, it's that thing where you get a piece of paper, somebody writes a line, you fold it over, the next person writes a line, you fold it over, and then you unfold it and you get a whole story. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. Each of our 6 authors will be contributing their own sort of paragraph or page to a story that will be told over the next 3 days. Following the rules, Anthony will be introducing us to our male protagonist, and then Matt will introduce us to our female protagonist. Are you ready, Anthony?
I'm back here to do it well.
Back here, you're ready. If you're all sitting comfortably, then Anthony will begin.
His name was Harry Carter, and he wasn't a happy man. All he'd ever dreamed about all his life was being a department store Santa Claus. But it never happened, maybe because his appearance was more than a little off-putting. Harry only had one leg. He had lost the other in Afghanistan, not in the army, but on a cycling holiday. He should never have taken that left turn. He was bald, malnourished, with wild, staring eyes and a wispy beard. Most days he sat outside Farringdon Station with his bulldog, Bruce, pretending to be homeless, even though he wasn't. He made about £5 a day from passers-by, and it infuriated him that Bruce made 15. But still he sat there, dreaming of the day he would get his revenge on a world that had never given him a sack, a red suit, and a gigantic white beard.
Cool, calm and exquisitely collected, the casual observer would never have guessed at the tumult of emotion raging inside Emma. Such was her preternatural poise. That was the thing about her, she was fire and ice. From an early age she'd been schooled to conceal her emotions, to retain an unruffled front. These lessons had served her well, and over time she'd learned to adapt effortlessly to her surroundings, to become a human chameleon. Who the real Emma Stroud actually was now open to doubt, so adept had she become at donning this emotional camouflage, to appear naive one minute, then worldly the next, now fiercely principled, now beyond redemption. If she'd ever had an inner core, it was now shrouded in layers of history and artifice. No one present had an inkling of who she was. She appeared utterly harmless, someone you might want to nurture and protect, rather than avoid. This had always been her greatest asset, the element of surprise, and she intended to make good use of it now. Nobody in this crumbling hellhole paid her the slightest heed, nor felt any need to fear her, principally perhaps because Emma Stroud was only 15 years old.
She wiped rainwater from her face, then passed quickly through the front bar, cloaked in the anonymity afforded by a small frame and a sopping wet raincoat, its hood pulled over her head like a cowl. She'd grown up in dives like this, small, solid, working-class pubs with bare board walls and threadbare tartan-covered floors, where the air was ash grey and the job of drinking was taken seriously. 2 rooms, the public bar for the men and the saloon bar for couples out courting or, heaven forbid, families. At one time in this part of town you could spit from the front of one to the door of the next, but gentrification meant there were fewer of them these days, a dying breed like the punters who frequented them. Even at this early hour, several men propped up the counter, old-timers with hair the colour of nicotine and sallow, capillary-pinched cheeks, poring over the Daily Record or nursing stale beer and whiskey chasers between cracked fingers. They reminded her of the jetsam that washed up on the black banks of the river at low tide. She made her way through to the back room, where she'd been told he liked to do business. A boy, thick-set, with cropped blonde hair and a face like a shovel, nodded as she entered. She ignored him and headed straight on, to the far end of the room, to where she could see him seated, his back against the cracked red vinyl of the banquette, his hands resting on the wooden table, waiting for her.
She sat opposite him. He reached into his pocket and took out a small hip flask and placed it on the table. On occasions like this, I generally suggest a drink, to loosen things up. He looked at her doubtfully. How old are you? She didn't reply. I know about you young people. He paused and frowned. To be honest, I don't know anything about you young people at all, but it's probably inappropriate, possibly illegal. He picked up the flask and looked at it. It belonged to my grandfather. It's always seemed a bit pointless. It doesn't hold enough to get a sparrow drunk. He replaced it in his pocket. Later, maybe, he said. I mean, for me, not for you. She looked around the room and then back at him. I know what you're thinking, he said. She only shrugged. Actually, that's a figure of speech. What I meant was that I know what you ought to be thinking. What you ought to be thinking is, am I here as a suspect, or as a victim, or as a witness, or as an innocent bystander? He thought for a moment. Have I left anything out? Seems a fairly inclusive list. She only shrugged. He smiled. I don't think you understand the situation. This is the nice bit. If you don't talk to me, things will take a turn for the worse. In her eyes he saw a flicker, just a flicker of interest. So, which is it? Suspect? Witness? What was the other one? He thought for a moment. Oh yes, victim.
As he finished the words, her phone beeped, and fishing it out of her pocket, she unlocked it and read the message on the screen, her face changing in an instant from polite preoccupation to horror. When she looked up, her expression was blank with shock. Sorry, what were you saying? He opened his mouth, about to recap, but she shook her head impatiently. Look, whatever, it doesn't matter at this point. Suspect, victim, whatever the other one was, who cares? We're wasting time with all this theorising, and you don't seem to understand the reality of the situation. Look! She held up the phone, showing him the Instagram picture that filled the screen, making him recoil with revulsion. Don't turn away, she cried, somehow sensing his desire to look somewhere, anywhere, but the image on the screen. Look at it. Really look. Do you get it now? This photograph is evidence. No, more than that, it's proof. We're dealing with something much bigger than a simple murder.
I know, she said. If this virus gets out, it could destroy all of humanity. We have to warn the government about what's going on before it's too late. Come on. She hurried towards the door, and knowing that they only had a few minutes before the power plant exploded. Already the heat from the fire on the platform below them was becoming unbearable. Not so fast, he said, and for the first time his voice was low and cold. She turned round and gasped. The man she trusted 100% was now pointing a gun straight at her. What's going on? She demanded. It's too late for humanity, he said. You have become obsolete. Now is the time of my people. With that, he grabbed his hair and pulled, and his whole face peeled away, revealing a grinning serpent's head beneath. Oh my God, she whispered. Who? What are you? The future, he hissed, stepping forward so the end of the gun barrel was only inches from her face. And with you out of the way, no one will ever know about the existence of the virus until it has affected all of your kind. His finger tightened on the trigger. She might have been terrified, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. And making use of her extensive Krav Maga training, she knocked the man-serpent's gun arm to one side before launching a series of kicks that sent him crashing backwards over the walkway's guardrail and into the sea of flames below. She watched as he disappeared from sight with a final strangled scream, knowing that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.
I knew it was going to end like that.